Hello everyone, and welcome to The Legend Makers. I'm your host Phil, and with me today is special guest, my brother/roommate. Over the course of these episodes, we're going to explore some popular stories we love and dive a little bit more deeply into the way that those stories can act as guides or tools for understanding the world around us. We're going to be drawing on a combo of philosophy, science, and religious thought to better explore those ideas. But at the end of the day, we don't really mean this to be an educational podcast. It's just for asking questions, starting interesting convos, and having fun.
God, it kills me every time in The Last Jedi when she says Godspeed. Just say,
May the
Force be with you. That's what they always say.
So welcome back, everybody, on this fine... Is it Monday or Tuesday?
It took us, I have to just note this, it took us 3 or 4 solid tries to get that hello.
Yeah, I feel like that meme from 30 Rock where Tina Fey is like, what a week, eh? And Alec Baldwin is like, Lemon, it's Wednesday, but it's only Monday. So before we begin today's episode, we're going to try something new today. This is what we are fondly referring to as the Jedi episode. So it's not a Star Wars episode, technically speaking, because we completely avoid talking about most of the plot of Star Wars. And as such, we're not going to have our initial section where we go through favorite scene, favorite character, and arbitrarily rate. Just because Star Wars is such a huge property that would take us far too long. And what we want to do today is focus on a few particular individual character journeys, and more so on George Lucas's idea and concept for what the Force is and how individuals engage with the Force in the story. So before we begin, I wanted to go back to our framework for these discussions that we brought up in episode 1, and we wanted to add something. Because I've been reading a book, which is actually a transcription of one of David Bohm's last seminars before he passed away. I think it was in 1992.
David Bohm is, for people who don't know, he's a famous physicist. He was one of Einstein's
I think he was Einstein's last grad student, yes. Something along those lines. And we mentioned him in the last episode. He's done a lot of really interesting work on the nature of thought and consciousness, I guess the physical world in the technical sense, right? Yeah. In the physics sense. And in reading this book, this idea came up, and I thought that it was really important to add to the way that we're approaching having these discussions on this podcast. So Bohm has this idea where he says, when we think, we need to present some sort of map of thought, which may be more coherent than the unspoken map implicit in our culture. His theory is that we all exist in this very complex system of thought that connects individuals' emotions, reflexes, memories, active information processing to, social norms, cultural norms, and a lot of the exchanges of idea and of reaction and of opinion and of etc. that happens is a unexamined part of a wider system that has many, many, many different variables at play. And so he is talking here about different strategies we may want to use to be able to reflect on why we think the things that we do and be able to take our thinking from unexamined to examined and really like contemplated, right? Yeah. To recognize. So he says the first step to transform, because his other point is that oftentimes because the system of thought is so complex and because many people are not aware of it and its complexity, then there's a lot of incoherency and internal like cognitive dissonance within the system of thought, which causes conflict, which means we have all these different problems.
That people aren't aware of what the implicit map means. Mm-hmm. And so when they act against it, there is a sense of contradiction within their own behavior.
Yes.
Where they believe one thing or they say one thing while doing something else.
Yes.
Or holding a different opinion that clashes.
Yeah. And this isn't those other people over there. It's like everyone. It's a part of human consciousness and the way that human beings think. Mm-hmm. So he suggests that the first step to being able to transform incoherence in the system of thought, action, behavior around us is to recognize the assumptions in that system and then contemplate them. The second step is to consider possible alternative ideas to those assumptions.
The concept that he presents, although it's not unique to him, about unspoken maps implicit in culture and using some sort of more explicit map to represent it in our thinking. That's pretty much what we're trying to do here with stories and mythology and the legend makers and all of that.
Yes.
So I think it's a pretty good idea to sort of segue into what we're going to be talking about today with respect to Star Wars, especially the concept of the Force that George Lucas created, as I think he even very explicitly intended Star Wars and many of its themes as being a simplified map for cultural norms and stories that have been told for thousands and thousands of years. And the concept of the Force was kind of at its core. So maybe you can start briefly on that if you want.
There's an excellent video that we will link in the description in which George Lucas talks at length about exactly what the Force means and what he intended by it and how it interacts with the characters in his story. And I've always found that to be kind of the perfect explanation of everything that happens in Star Wars, because everything that happens is as a direct extension of the logic that he presents there. We wanted to, I think this is, we called this the Jedi episode, and it's because we wanted to dive into the concept of the dark side versus the light side of the Force and what that means for an individual's journey. Ultimately, everything we're going to talk about is hinged on the fact that in the Star Wars universe, everything is connected through the Force, which interestingly is the same kind of interconnectedness that we spoke of in last week's episode, in the Wonder Woman episode. That there is some universal, uniting, binding force that we are able to then tap into. And in Star Wars, it's a very literal tapping into.
Yeah.
Like, they can lift things and they could, ship things and do telepathy.
It gives them very, very literal powers.
It gives them very literal powers through their their internal spiritual orientation and behavior, which, as we spoke about in the very first episode, Tolkien also implies in his concept of eucatastrophe. Now, George Lucas very kind of simply explains that, and there's been so much popularized discourse over what the light side is versus what the dark side is, and like Jedi bad actually, I guess reimagination.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, wait, can I? Because I think we should really hammer this home so that people don't think that we're taking sides.
Yeah.
Like we said in our very first episode with respect to our framework, the author of any particular property isn't necessarily, their word isn't gospel.
Yes.
And people are allowed to have their own opinions. But in our particular opinion, Star Wars is designed as a universe to operate according to
very particular rules.
Very particular rules in its meta-narrative.
Yes.
Right? And meta-narrative is sort of the key mesh that ties everything together. And because the rules are so explicitly laid out in the story.
And quite simple, actually.
Yeah, you really kind of can't over-elaborate it and try and change it to what you would like it to be.
Yes.
Because then it gets really inconsistent and confusing.
Yeah, well then it's no longer Star Wars as a story. Then you're coming up with a different fantasy sci-fi universe. And that's okay, but it's not Star Wars. Back to...
Basically, gray Jedi don't exist.
Yes.
We'll get into that after.
Back to George Lucas's very simple description of the light side versus the dark side of the Force. He says the light side of the Force is selflessness and selfless behavior, and the dark side of the Force is selfishness or selfish behavior. On the dark side of the Force, this state of self-centeredness or self-motivatedness includes, I think, attributes or behaviors like fear, attachment, guilt, the need to control everything, even stuff like self-loathing or hate, whether it be hate of others or hate of yourself, all fall under an inwardly looking or selfishly motivated state of being. Whereas on the other side, on the light side of the Force, I think the primary characteristic or attribute at play here is detachment as a form of expressing selflessness. And that detachment does not mean apathy, but rather outward-looking behavior, including compassion, seeking to help others, a state of peace with the outcome of your actions, and yet a desire or motivation to help.
I think a great thing to bring up is just so clear.
Or like do good, not help, sorry.
Yeah, okay. So through the story, I think it's really clear, especially on the side of the dark side, and George Lucas talks about this in the video, that the Sith are always unhappy. And one of the biggest factors that is discussed a lot is their desire for power, for control. When they have something, they always want more, or they live in fear of losing what they have.
Yeah.
And a big meme in Star Wars is the fact
the rule of two.
So basically, long story short, it's just that you have a master and an apprentice, and the apprentice is always trying to recruit another apprentice
so that he can, kick off the master.
So they can join forces and kill the master, and the master knows this, and so he's always trying to
kill his apprentice
before his apprentice can kill him.
Yes.
And there's this kind of hilarious,
it's weirdly a sustainable ecosystem.
But that's kind of the point, is the Sith are always unhappy, even though they're constantly feeding their own sense of control and power.
They're also feeding their sense of fear. Like, they're constantly self-generating the fear because they have put themselves in a position where they care so much about their individual position and state.
And
regardless of whether it's like the megalomaniac Machiavellian type power that Palpatine has, or Vader's more pathetic self-destructive, he's almost attached to his own misery at a certain point, and like he has no identity without that.
Yeah, exactly.
So if he loses that, then everything was for naught, and he's the biggest clown there is. I mean, he is the biggest clown there is, but we'll get there soon.
On the other side, I think a lot of times, and we'll get into the actual Jedi as an institution in the story, but the concept of the light side of the Force, represented by a true Jedi or a knight for the world, essentially, like not necessarily a savior, but a protector of others. Their role and their being is intended to be selfless and good and helpful, and balance in the Force essentially means balance in the light side, as opposed to there being an even amount of light and dark. The point is, all Jedi struggle with the dark side of the Force. All people struggle with the dark side of the Force.
All human beings.
And the dark side of the Force, it's not necessarily a scale where you fall somewhere between one extreme or another. Instead, it's like the center is the light, and straying from the path is being pulled towards the dark. And you can be pulled towards the dark in an infinite number of different ways. And everyone struggles with it. Even someone who's been a Jedi for hundreds of years can still struggle with the dark side, or someone who's just learning the path of the Jedi. So it's really just a very simple metaphor for all human beings. And it's reflected in many different philosophies and cultures and religions about living on the straight path, walking the straight path, living in balance, living in all these kinds of things. Balance in here, that doesn't mean a sense of a scale where you're being balancing between two different equal and opposite weights, right?
Well, I think, Lucas didn't invent this stuff. He was inspired by a number of different
religions,
universal philosophies, right? I mean, there's a lot of Buddhism or more Eastern thought in there. There's definitely a lot of Sufism. I mean, he's never come and said it out loud, but like personally, from everything that I've read of Sufi mysticism, there's a lot of it in Star Wars philosophy. Honestly, even elements of like more Judeo-Christian, or it is like more structured religious institutions, societies like Islam or...
Well, from what I understand of what he said, and again, we don't need to get too much into his intentions, but his intention was to package together all of the common elements of different philosophies and cultures. And even the concept of the Force, he says that the name just comes from the concept of life force that many ancient religions believed in as being the fabric of their world, being the life force of all things. And I mean, he also includes a lot of psychology. Is really important to mention, like issues about self-actualization and I don't know, people like Carl Jung.
Who we'll bring up in a minute.
spiritual enlightenment, the whole deal is all in there, but it's all simplified so that it's kind of its bare bones essentials.
Yeah, well, because Star Wars is ultimately a story for children, which I think a lot of people forget a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be deep or impactful.
No, stories for children are often the most universal of stories.
Yeah.
I mean, C.S. Lewis talked about this, where he said a good children's story is a story that anybody at any age can enjoy. And indeed, many adult stories are less accessible because they try so hard to be adult that they miss the point that they're trying to make. The last thing that I want to say about the philosophy of the Force is that in Star Wars, when characters encounter suffering, and this kind of goes back to the original Lord of the Rings episode, where Eucatastrophe does not discount the very real experience of suffering in everyday life and in the universe, right? When characters experience suffering or feelings of helplessness or having no control, giving into those and not being at peace with the reality that things around you will change and you will experience difficulty only leads to more helplessness, more hatefulness, and further suffering. Whereas when in a position of ill fortune or difficulty, if you focus on giving of yourself to others and serving the world around you, being a part of something greater than yourself, you are more resilient and joyful. Now, I think that that's something we can elaborate on because it can, without the right parameters, something like that can easily be mistaken for, well, I should never take care of myself. Selflessness in this situation does not mean a lack of self-awareness, nor a reckless endangerment of the self. And similarly, discipline does not mean wearing yourself to the bone or never thinking about your own well-being.
It isn't asceticism.
No, it's not asceticism. And I think this goes back to you bringing up Jung as an inspiration for Jung or Young.
Doesn't matter.
I've heard it both ways.
Carl.
Our homie Carl.
Not the other Carl, the psychologist Carl, not Revolution Carl.
Carl Jung is known to have said, quote, "One must never give way to fear, but must admit to oneself that one is afraid. This requires a degree of self-awareness and the ability to self-reflect and then be able to make your peace with that part of yourself," which I think maybe we will talk about later, but was one of the downfalls of the Jedi Order as an institution, where they insisted that fear was bad, but they did not accept nor recognize that they themselves were constantly afraid, both of their own potential failure, of the dark side of the Force, of the corruption and confusion that was going on around them, and as such were mired in that fear and unable to move beyond it.
Yeah.
Similarly, the fear of one's own potential to do wrong or a fear of evil is almost as bad as the wrong itself. This is another idea in Star Wars quite often, and I think also discussed, I mean, in other, I think, children's literature property.
For sure.
It's in Harry Potter, the Dementor thing, where it's like the most important thing to fear is fear itself.
Yeah, well, it's the fear of the darkness within. And we're going to talk about how that relates especially to Luke's story.
I mean, the other source that this idea of fear of evil or of one's potential to do wrong is almost as bad as the wrong itself is something that's found in certain religious texts as well, where there's this idea of the kingdom of veils. I think it's in Christianity as well as the Baha'i faith, where
it's in many.
I mean,
religions.
it's in many religions in different
concept,
forms, but the concept is that pretty much anything, if you are overly attached to it, can cloud your judgment and end up becoming the pitfall. Like it becomes your fatal flaw, right? If
exactly.
You get too freaked out about it, you know, that's it. Like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Almost like in Greek mythology, the idea of hubris.
Yeah, well, hubris is one of the
one of the veils or the fatal flaws.
Just something briefly to bring up with respect to possible paths towards darkness, because there aren't just one. You can, like we just said, any kind of veil is essentially being drawn towards the dark in terms of the Star Wars mythology. And just as fear of one's potential to do wrong or fear of evil is very much dangerous, so is the fear of losing loved ones, or not necessarily losing them by chance, but being unable to protect them or care for them.
Yes.
So becomes a big thing in Star Wars, and it has to do with an individual loving others and wanting good for them.
Yes.
But it becomes a selfish kind of love. And we'll talk about that with respect to Anakin's story.
Yeah, I think that's...
We can just start right now.
There are, I think, 2 key parallel storylines. If I'm going to be completely honest here, Star Wars is a story about Anakin Skywalker. It's the story of Anakin Skywalker. And I think Luke is a critical element of the story of Anakin Skywalker. But ultimately, the story is Anakin's story, and Luke is what brings the story full circle. He is invaluable to the story, but it's not actually Luke Skywalker's story.
What we can do is maybe just really briefly summarize the Anakin plot from episode 1 to episode 6 in a really simple sense. Do you want to do it, or should I?
I feel compelled to sing the Weird Al Yankovic.
The saga begins.
The saga begins.
We can start with that. So a long
time ago,
Naboo was under an attack, and I found me and Qui-Gon Jinn could talk the Federation into. I won't go on. But okay, point is, I'll do it quickly. You have a kid. He's born into slavery. He dreams of helping his mother and escaping.
And the rest of the galaxy.
Exactly. He's taken in by the Jedi Order, which is this big institution of spirituals / monks.
Well, they're keepers of the peace.
They're keepers of the peace, but there's a whole political story that gets wrapped up into everything, and the Order isn't perfect. And essentially, with respect to Anakin's story, he grows up in his teen years as a learner. He has a master, Obi-Wan. Over the course of his youth, he falls in love with a woman who becomes very important to him, Padme. They get married in secret because the Jedi forbid romantic relationships and...
Well, personal attachments.
Yes, but it's mostly just you can't engage romantically with someone as a significant other.
But you can have sex if it's meaningless.
Yeah, the logic is unclear. We're not going to get into that. That's like universe
there's
stuff.
Just that like one guy who's allowed to have like 200 wives because his species has like a surplus of women but no men.
I think his species has like, I don't know, one man born per like 1,000 women or something.
Yeah, classic Star Wars.
But putting Ki-Adi-Mundi aside, the point is Anakin feels disillusioned eventually in many different ways with the Jedi Order. He thinks it's corrupt, or he thinks that they're wrong about certain key ideas. He has to keep his love a secret. He feels that the banning of romantic relationships is hypocritical because the Jedi stress compassion and love towards others, and he finds that these ideas are in conflict within him. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the key element in his story is his mother is killed, and he's unable to save her as he originally intended, and he feels guilt for leaving her to die. And in addition, he sees that in the future, his wife, which is Padme, they're married, who is going to have their kid.
No kidding. Yeah. His wife, they're married.
Okay. I'm trying to really shorten things here. They're married, they're going to have a kid. He believes that she's going to die in childbirth, and the fear of losing her, who he's so attached to, he feels that he needs to have the power to stop death. And essentially, as George Lucas describes it, he makes a deal with the devil and sells his own soul for the power to be able to save his beloved. Which was
a lie.
Yeah, and it's a lie, exactly. Yeah. He doesn't have that power. It's a trick. And Palpatine, the evil, essentially he's Satan. Yeah. He manipulates him and draws him closer and closer to the darkness over time. He corrupts him, and eventually he manages to turn him to the dark side. And Anakin Skywalker dies, and he's reborn as Darth Vader, who is this terrible Sith Lord. He does terrible things, all in the name of gaining power and control. And in the end, his wife ends up dying. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. He loses everything, and the Jedi Order are destroyed. And then smash cut, what is
20
it?
Years later. No, 18.
18 years later.
18 years later.
His son, who was hidden away by Obi-Wan, his old master, and raised on his old home planet in secret, he essentially joins the rebellion against this galactic empire that Palpatine and Darth Vader have built. He becomes a member of the rebellion, and he becomes a Jedi because the Force is strong with him. Instead of fighting Darth Vader, so Luke finds out eventually that Darth Vader is actually his father. Yeah. And Darth Vader is the worst dude in the universe at this point, barring Palpatine. But not many people really
actually know Palpatine exists.
Exactly. Luke, in the final movie, instead of killing the big evil man who is his father, he instead believes that there is goodness in him, and he refuses to kill him, and he essentially redeems and saves him, brings him back to the light before Darth Vader eventually dies.
In an effort to save Luke's life.
In an effort to save his son.
Yeah.
And then he destroys Palpatine.
In the process. An important point to be made is that Anakin is not... He is to be held accountable, and it is his choice in the end to do terrible things. Mm-hmm. But it's also not entirely his fault that he ended up in the position that he ended up in.
It's like a Shakespearean tragedy.
Yes. It's one of those, like, awful, tragic stories that you can see exactly why everything happens as it happens. And it makes perfect sense that it happens the way it does, because Anakin is not afforded the opportunity to openly give and receive the compassion that as a small child he was so good at giving and receiving. I mean, he's thrust into a galactic war at the age of like 20, right?
Yeah.
And, told to head armies. I think that's enough to screw anybody up.
Yeah.
Let alone, someone who is already pretty screwed up after, losing his mother, being separated from her for many years during his formative time.
Well,
so,
it's at the end of the day, I think it's a combination of him having a lot of unresolved childhood trauma and the fact that unlike most Jedi who are raised in the Order, he already had formed many attachments and he had already lived a life of suffering before he became a Jedi. And so he doesn't quite understand this issue of no attachments, this issue of he already has too many, and so he already has a lot to lose. He already has very strong feelings that he can't shake from himself because they've never properly been dealt with. And the Jedi Order plays a big role in failing to help him because of their fear of making mistakes, because Anakin is supposedly the chosen one. And so they kind of treat him with kid gloves. They're scared of him. They don't want to be honest with him. They make a lot of mistakes. And that also contributes, in addition to Palpatine being like evil puppet master man.
Yes, but I think this goes back to what we were talking about in the logic of the universe and the Force, of the fact that many of the things that end up happening to Anakin could be avoided if both he and the people around him and the institutions around him were more outward looking and less inward looking. Like, one of the reasons that, and again, being outward looking versus inward looking is not necessarily an issue of goodwill or intention. Like Obi-Wan, for example, best dude in the world, right? He's trying so hard. Man did not deserve the life of suffering that he got. But he also doesn't necessarily have the skills or tools to be able to be outward looking and openly compassionate and understanding and be the, I think, listening and understanding ear and the communicative ear that Anakin needs, right? And again, that's not necessarily Obi-Wan's fault. It's an issue of a misunderstanding of the nature of the Force. But had many of the people around Anakin been outward looking, I think in a way that his mother was, right? Had Anakin had the opportunity to grow up alongside his mother, or even Qui-Gon in the...
I was going to bring this up later.
Yeah.
But we can talk about it now briefly if you want to get into that.
Well, I was going to say that it would have given him the opportunity to be able to grow and mature those attachments and the many, many feelings in his heart into well-adjusted relationships, as opposed to kind of aborted a child's need for love and companionship.
Yeah, I'll leave what I was going to say for later. I'll bring it up later. Don't worry. So I think what we can talk about is, what is the pattern between Anakin's story and Luke? Where Anakin fails, how does Luke succeed?
So I think when you look at Luke's journey compared to Anakin's, there are a lot of key points where he makes choices, like putting aside the fact that he had a far more well-adjusted childhood, which is relevant, I think that's always relevant in everybody's lives, particularly because that allows other people to look at them and feel empathy and not condemn them outright for their decision making. But Luke is faced with a series of choices over the course of the trilogy, and at every single turn, with the exception of a few where he makes mistakes, and he pays for them, his choices are choices of wanting to help others, wanting to be there for his friends, being filled with love and compassion and caring for others, and belief in the goodness of others. I think from the very first movie, with all of his like goofy little interactions with Han, like he believes that other people can be good, even when they decide to prove otherwise temporarily, right? And that guides a lot of Luke's decision making throughout the story. Now, that doesn't mean that Luke does not carry anger in his heart, or does not get frustrated, or does not feel betrayed or hurt or confused, or, you know, all of these different things. I think Empire Strikes Back is a perfect example of all of the ways in which,
he struggles with his discipline and his training. He struggles with understanding how the Force operates. He doesn't feel like he can relinquish that control. He feels like he needs to be doing more. He needs to be seeing results. He feels like he's wasting his time, which are things that everyone struggles with. Right?
Exactly. And ultimately, when he thinks that his friends are in danger, he makes the reckless decision to go after them. Now, ultimately, that saves his friend's life. Like, that saves Leia's life, and then they're able to go and rescue Han at the beginning of the next movie. But the decision to get up and go, being unprepared, also costs Luke dearly. He loses his hand, and he's faced with this awful realization that, you know, his father is like #1 clown in the universe. Cause of all of this pain and suffering, right? The choices Luke ends up making after that, though, he could very easily, and Lucas has talked about this, about the fact that at the beginning of the third movie, like, the reason why Luke shows up in his, like, sexy black Chanel outfit is because Lucas was teasing the audience with the idea that this guy isn't all good. He's not like this perfect, untaintable character. He could turn to the dark side, like his father before him, right? But from the beginning of the movie, Luke consciously makes decisions that dually are directed towards helping others, but also are detached from the outcome of his efforts to help others. He goes with his friends, like he goes with the rebels to like blow up the second Death Star and helps them out. But ultimately, he has to leave Han and Leia behind on Endor and go face Vader and Palpatine. But he has faith that
he learns to trust his friends. He learns
to trust the people around him.
He learns to believe that his faith will be rewarded, and that when he makes the best possible choices he can make, others do the same. I think, in my opinion, at least as I understand the story, Anakin's fatal flaw is all about relinquishing control, and it's the issue that George Lucas talks about in the video that we're going to link. He possesses people in his love. They're objects that he cannot let go of. He needs them, and he's so dependent on them being there for him to not lose his sanity that he isn't willing to listen to them at times. He isn't willing to let them help him, let them comfort him, especially with respect to Padme.
And even Obi-Wan.
Yeah, and even Obi-Wan.
And even Ahsoka.
And as a result of that, when he feels like they're not letting him control them, and they're not listening to him, he feels like they've betrayed him.
He freaks out.
Because in his mind, he's trying to do what's best for them. He's trying to help them, and they're rebuffing him, and that drives him crazy. And so he kind of seems like he has these massive mood swings at times, where in 1 second he's like, oh, I love Obi-Wan, he's my father, but in many ways I hate him. It really shows how confused he is with respect to all his emotions, and that is very well contrasted with Luke's relationship with his friends and his family. I guess they are basically. Yeah,
they're basically his family. I mean, Leia's literally his twin sister, but like, we're talking about like Han and Chewie and Lando.
Everyone, R2-D2.
Everyone.
At the end of the day, I mean, I think we don't want to hammer this home too hard. My interpretation of Star Wars, and what we're going to talk about a little bit more here, is that becoming a Jedi is self-actualization. And there's a moment, or not necessarily, it's not a as though you suddenly overcome the dark side, but there are turning points in every individual's life where they overcome a major obstacle and they achieve enlightenment in the Star Wars sense of it. And
I think the other area where Luke demonstrates his faith in others and his detachment from the outcome of his own efforts is, again, in Return of the Jedi, when he goes with Vader to Palpatine's ship.
That's what I was gonna bring up.
Okay.
It's okay. So, it's okay. Let me get there. Have faith.
Yes.
Have faith in your brother.
Yes.
So people always meme about you're on the council, but we do not grant you the rank of master.
Yes.
And it's hilarious. But in my mind, I think the reason that that's included in the story, beyond it being extra motivation for him to get worked up, is...
And Mace Windu just like screwing with Anakin at every possible turn.
Well, I think it's because Anakin never has actually reached this point of self-actualization. He actually hasn't become a Jedi in his heart of hearts yet. He never actually, as skilled as he is in manipulating the Force and fighting, because he's the greatest warrior, right? He never actually, in his heart, becomes...
That's so ironic.
Yeah, he never actually becomes a Jedi in overcoming his fatal flaw. And he's constantly struggling with it, and at the end of the day, he fails. And Luke does the opposite. And his moment of... Because I think as much as Anakin's fatal flaw is this issue of possessive love and attachment and want to gain power so that he may protect his loved one. Luke's, I think, although all of them have stories of wanting to protect loved ones and the fear that comes along with that, Luke's, I think, has to do with Vader. It has to do with the fear of the potential for evil within himself. He's held back by... And that's what in Empire Strikes Back...
When he goes into the cave. And there's this spooky, Darth Vader's face is actually his face.
He fights Vader, and under Vader's helmet, it's him.
Yes.
And this is before he even learns that Vader is his father.
Yeah.
And at the end of the movie, the last movie, where Palpatine is trying to turn him to the dark side, his fundamental struggle is choosing to fight. He becomes his father. Yeah. And that's the one thing that he cannot do. And his choice, the moment, which is really, I think, beautiful because of the way it's worded, the moment that he says, "I am a Jedi like my father before me," and it's so good.
That's I'm gonna start crying.
That's the moment where he becomes a Jedi, is when he says it like that, in that scenario, making the choice, right? And I think that's what he overcomes that flaw of the darkness within. He no longer fears his father. He no longer fears what he could be, but rather is committed to making the choice of not worrying about who he could be, but rather just being who he is and trusting others to follow him and to work with him. Right.
No, I agree completely. Every time I think of that line or listen to that line or even vaguely remember that line, I get so emotional.
Because unlike how Vader or Anakin couldn't trust in Padme or Obi-Wan to work with him and help him, Luke, from the moment he sees Vader before that scene and they're interacting, he's constantly like, "No, bro, I believe in you. Yeah. You may say that you're evil, but I see through the lies of the Vader. I know you're good. You're just messing with me. And at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, you're going to be good."
Yes.
And it's that faith. He believes that it's not about what choice he makes. He has to believe that his father will make the right choice. And he's, of course, redeemed eucatastrophically, I guess you could put it.
Two ideas. There's an interview with George Lucas that I've got an excerpt of here. Lucas brings up 2 points. One, he says that the building of anything, the progress of anything, has to be done through reason, love, and compassion, not through violence. The other thing he says is that there are cycles and circles in the story of Star Wars of multiple different characters, not just through all 6 episodes, but, I think also into some of the extended media that we're going to mention. That they're all cycles of the same type of story being repeated over and over again with different groups of people struggling with different variations of the same thing. Just as Luke was struggling with a variation of the same thing Anakin was struggling with, so too, does characters like Ezra and Kanan in Rebels, or Cal
Big
from...
fan of Cal Kestis.
Cal Kestis?
And,
Where is Cal Kestis? Is he alright? Is he safe?
Jedi Fallen Order, great game.
Or even Ahsoka, right?
Yeah.
Ahsoka and Obi-Wan both struggle with similar things and come out differently. Yoda struggles with very similar things, comes out differently. Like, not similar things in that they have the same story. They all have slightly different stories, but
they're all struggling with different aspects of the dark side. And I really wanted to bring this up because I think it's one of my favorite things about Star Wars. Is the ability to show the different degrees and the levels. Sorry, go ahead if you wanted to finish.
I'm done.
I think especially, I don't want to go too deeply into, if people have seen Rebels or they've played Fallen Order, you'll know what we're talking about. But otherwise, it's not important. The main point is a character like Cal, for example, in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. It's a long title. The point is, he has a journey of becoming a Jedi, and similar to him, a character like Kanan in Rebels. They were both very young when the Jedi Order fell. In Order 66, where essentially they were purged. There was a genocide of Jedi. They were all killed. They were all betrayed. And so both characters carry a lot of baggage with them.
Yeah, and trauma.
They have trauma. They feel a lot of guilt. And the main thing that both of them struggle with is letting go of the sense of guilt, because both of their masters were killed in front of them. They felt helpless. They were unable to stop them. They lost their families. And it's that sense of helplessness and a lack of power. But rather than expressing it aggressively in the way that Anakin does, in his possessiveness, they retreat into themselves. They run away from the world. And I think that's a great different form of problems, and that's also the dark side. It's not as though the dark side is always aggressive. It can be very slow and like chip away at your soul and slowly destroy you. And the sense of shame that they feel, the sense of regret, it cripples them from being able to live in the present and being able to be good people and help people now. And that's a big part of their journey in their respective stories of overcoming that and believing in themselves, right? Believing that what they can do, what they have to offer to others is worth working towards. Again, a character like Ezra is a lot more similar to Anakin, and he's kind of like Anakin's story if it turned out well. And I wanted to bring this up because you mentioned the whole Dave Filoni brings up the Duel of the Fates, how that scene is actually the fate deciding the fate of Anakin because he's a kid and Qui-Gon is the father he never had. And Qui-Gon, unlike the other Jedi, is a bit of a rebel, and he believes in showing love in a much more explicit sense. He wants to be,
and also questioning the establishment, like being able to talk through your feelings.
He wants
normal
to be
human things.
A father to Anakin. He wants to care for him. He wants to be honest with him and encourage him to speak his mind. All of those things. And when he's killed, and instead Obi-Wan becomes Anakin's master, that's kind of the sad twist of fate, where Obi-Wan, as good of a person as he is, he grew up in the Jedi Order and he's not particularly rebellious.
Well, he was also barely like a kid himself. He wasn't prepared to be given a child to take care of.
His relationship with Anakin is described often as being that of brothers. They work together, but they're different and they're kind of on the same level. He isn't capable of offering that kind of guidance and wisdom that Qui-Gon could have. And I think a great parallel to that is the relationship that Kanan and Ezra have in Rebels, because Kanan is almost the Qui-Gon to Anakin.
To Ezra's Anakin,
right? Where he has a master, but he has a master who is essentially his father. Right? And he loves him and shows his love in a familial sense. Beyond just kind of a go do this and that. You know, I believe in you, but also I'm gonna like leave you to your own devices. You know,
I think from the very beginning, their familial relationship takes primacy over their
because
master.
Ezra struggles with the same things that Anakin struggles with.
He's lost his family. He feels guilt over losing. He feels like
he needs power to protect the people he loves. He wants, and the number one turning point for him is with respect to learning from Kanan. In particular, we won't get into spoilers, but he learns from Kanan that his role in life is to trust people and to be self-sacrificial, essentially, as opposed to needing to constantly shield people and protect them through force of will or violence, as opposed to him being able to express love and a sense of caring through gentleness and kindness and
like steadiness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's that ability to help transform others and help transform collective societies, to inspire people through the goodness of one's own heart and soul and emotion and everything that makes you such a wonderful, unique person. Being able to express all of that, share it with everyone around you. That's what can transform and save people, as opposed to trying to fight for them and kill for them, right?
Well, that's what Luke did.
Exactly.
Luke transformed Vader by just being the best.
Exactly.
Now, I think you bringing up Kanan and Ezra is a great transition into talking about the difference between detachment and fear in terms of the conceptually the light and dark side of the Force. I think the final season arc of Rebels, one of the key things that Ezra learns from Kanan's actions is this issue of detachment. Detachment from the outcome of your sacrifices, and detachment from the people who, not detachment from the people who love you in an apathetic sense, but the ability to be at peace with the fact that you love others and they love you, and that is going to endure regardless of what happens.
That's a very good point.
I think that that's a great segue into discussing theoretically, philosophically, the difference between what detachment means and what fear is, and why maybe fear can be such a negative influence in life, whereas detachment can be a positive influence, and what its implications are for our regular lives. And this relates to Star Wars because Star Wars has a lot of politics and a lot of discussion of like different kinds of organizational regimes and the corruption of institutions. But we can see throughout history that any institutions built or organized according to fear as a motivation, whether it be fear of the other, fear of failure, fear of self, are easily, if not inevitably, corrupted. Like, there's a lot of research documenting the fact that many authoritarian regimes implemented in wartime, which is something that literally just happens in Star Wars, happen because the social consciousness is one of fear, anger, betrayal, embitterment.
People need to feel in control. They need to feel powerful.
Exactly.
It's just all the dark side Sith stuff.
I can link some articles in the description of like more specific examples of this.
And maybe we can particularly talk a bit more now about the Jedi Order.
While the Jedi as a philosophical concept remained correct. And I think this is part of what Ahsoka struggled with, of her like actualization arc, where she really struggled with being able to separate what it truly means to be a Jedi with the very real corruption and like bureaucracy and confusion of the institution of the Jedi Order, to separate the principle from
it's
the
really
organization.
Jedi only in name at that point in history.
Yes. It reflects a lot of current institutions in our world. I mean, we mentioned, I think in the Dark Knight episode, this issue of placing all of your faith in an institution that represents an ideal can be dangerous because the institution is open to corruption, because it's flawed. It's mortal. It's in a sense.
There are people that make it up.
There are people that make it up.
Those people have agendas. They have their own personal failings. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong.
When the conditions around an institution are those of uncertainty and chaos and destruction, as is both the case in the Star Wars universe and our own universe, it becomes very easy for well-meaning individuals in the institution to act out of fear, to try to help others out of fear, and by doing so lose sight of
the true consequences of what they're doing.
Exactly.
I think what we really want to hammer home here with respect to the Jedi Order, a lot of people interpret Star Wars as a real thing, whereas the Jedi Order it's not really supposed to be all about its lore or its history. At its core, I think, at least how I understand it, it represents a collection of well-meaning people who have succumbed to issues of dogma. They've become rigid, and particularly they, at the core of their choices and organization, they fear the dark side.
Yeah.
They fear fear itself, in a sense, which is really unhealthy for them.
Yeah.
Because they talk all about how their vision is clouded by the dark side and all that.
Your vision is
where
flawed.
They're very much aware
That's a great scene, by the way.
they're very much aware of the influence of darkness in people's decision making and in the world. They're constantly there, but they can't recognize how they may be succumbing to it. They can't recognize what they need to be doing and how they need to be changing in order to combat that. They keep looking inward. They keep, ironically, in their attempt to be helpers of the galaxy, they try and focus on, well, you know, we're the Jedi, we have these ideals and we need to stick to them, and it doesn't matter what that person says or what's going on there or what problems there might be. We need to make sure that we're not compromising our own situation. We need to make sure that, you know, we aren't corrupting ourselves. Right.
Which is, it's not truly selfless in nature, because it's like,
exactly.
You're frightened of,
The Jedi Order's fall with Order 66 is kind of just punctuating the end of an era. They were already lost at that point. And I think characters like Yoda are supposed to already know that to a certain degree when the time comes. And in I know a lot of people like to hate on Yoda for some reason because he was the top dog of the Jedi Order, but he's one of the most aware of all the Jedi of what's going wrong, and his fatal character flaw is not knowing how to deal with that. He just tries his best to help people, but he can't really handle this kind of looming issue of, I'm the head of this institution which is collapsing in on itself, and the only thing that he can really say or do is like, hey, like, hope you're looking good out there, you know? Like, he's nice and encouraging.
He tries so hard to encourage the people around him, but he has no idea how to deal with the fact that it's gotten so bad that it's entirely out of his control, and ultimately, like, out of his literal obvious control, right? And ultimately he ends up self-exiling.
No, exactly.
Because of how crushed he is by everything that happens. And I think Yoda is an incredibly empathetic and feeling character, and that's often forgotten about him.
He runs away is the point. He
runs away from his problems because that's so overwhelming for him. And that is, I think, a nice contrast with Luke in Empire Strikes Back and in Return of the Jedi, where Luke learns from Yoda. I don't think Luke ever hates Yoda or is angry with Yoda for the mistakes that Yoda has made, but he takes it a step further. He does what Yoda couldn't do, and he walks towards his problems.
Exactly. Like in that scene in Empire where Yoda is trying to convince Luke to not go. It's a mistake, right? Even though it is a literal mistake, in terms of the meta-narrative, it isn't, because Yoda is worried entirely in that scene about losing their one shot at killing the Emperor. All he can think about is that, well, Luke is the only one strong enough to eventually take on the Emperor. He needs to be trained. We need to keep him safe. We need to prepare him, and then he can go do this thing, and then everything will be fixed, right? He doesn't think about the fact, well, Luke says, oh, my friends are currently suffering, and they need to be helped, or these people are going to be killed, and we need to help save them. He's thinking entirely about how to almost relieve his own conscience, because he feels guilty
that he failed
for letting Palpatine come to power. He feels guilty for the Empire destroying the galaxy.
Which, like, again, I think that's an illusion, that it was entirely in his hands.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. But the same problem is turning inwards and blaming himself, thinking that he could have done something better and it wouldn't have turned out a certain way, right? Even if it's true, it still destroys him. He's kind of representative of the entire Jedi Order in that sense. They're well-meaning people. You meet so many of them, especially in the Clone Wars TV show, that are all very wholesome, lovely people. They're wise.
Except for Pong Krell.
What
a jerk.
He's not even a Jedi. We're not going to talk about it. But
we are anti-Pong Krell on this podcast.
He looks cool. I have to give it to him. He's like Dexter Jetster, but with 4 double-sided lightsabers.
That's just General Grievous.
No, General Grievous has 4 single-sided
True,
lightsabers.
true. Can't get on
Wait, no, sorry.
level.
Von Krell only has 2 double-sided lightsabers. He just has 4 arms, so he like flips between the arms.
Oh, I see.
That's why I sometimes make the mistake. The point here is the Jedi aren't bad people. As much as people like to make it out as, oh, the Jedi Order was corrupt and evil and like they would kill people or whatever.
Yeah. War crimes.
Yeah, or whatever. The point at the end of the day has to do with how well-meaning people can be blinded to the problems that they're causing in their attempts to do good out of even just the fear of what they're facing themselves, of this evil force that's trying to destroy all the good that they're doing. It pushes them inwards. It blinds them to what is truly happening and what they're doing to themselves and the world.
No, I think that this is an excellent place to bring up a passage from the poet Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, which is...
Sorry, the poet Khalil Gibran, and his book is named The Prophet.
Yes.
Okay.
He was a Lebanese poet, and his book, The Prophet, is one of his most famous works. And it's a bit of a long passage, but I really want to read the whole thing because he really drives home in this passage this idea that even good philosophy or concept or goals, when reified or turned into something that you are overly attached to, which we talked about earlier, can in itself be the thing you quote, swore to destroy.
Yeah.
In The Prophet, it goes, quote, "And how shall you rise beyond your days and nights, unless you break the chains which you at the dawn of your understanding have fastened around your noon hour? In truth, that which you call freedom is the strongest of these chains, though its links glitter in the sun and dazzle your eyes. And what is it but fragments of your own self you would discard, that you may become free? If it is an unjust law you would abolish, that law was written with your own hand upon your own forehead. You cannot ease it by burning your law books, nor by washing the foreheads of your judges, though you pour the sea upon them. And if it is a despot you would dethrone, see first that his throne erected within you is destroyed. For how can a tyrant rule the free and the proud, but for a tyranny in their own freedom and a shame in their own pride? And if it is a care you would cast off, that cart has been chosen by you rather than imposed upon you. And if it is a fear you would dispel, the seat of that fear is in your heart and not in the hand of the feared. Verily, all things move within your being in constant half-embrace, the desired and the dreaded, the repugnant and the cherished, the pursued and that which you would escape. These things move within you as lights and shadows in pairs that cling, and when the shadow fades and is no more, the light that lingers becomes a shadow to another light, and thus your freedom, when it loses its fetters, becomes itself the fetter of a greater freedom." Now, I think that was quite poetical in its language, but its idea, it used the concept of freedom as the thing that you become attached to, and then
And of course, if you want, I guess we can link that just so that people can read it.
Yeah, no, I'm going to link the Project Gutenberg version of The Prophet in the description. It is well worth a read.
Yeah. And I mean, you can even just rewind and re-listen if you didn't catch everything there.
But I mean, I think that summarizes everything that we just talked about really well. We talked a lot about why fear is bad, but why be detached, and what does that mean? So what's the deeper philosophical explanation? Both in Star Wars, through the concept of the Force, of something universal that binds everything together, and also throughout history, many philosophers have talked about this, many religions have talked about this. There is something of design out there that will not let you fall in the absolute irreversible sense. There can always be growth. And indeed, growth is an embedded natural part of the world. Nature is full of cycles of growth.
Can I propose that in lieu of in Star Wars, they say trust in the Force?
Yes.
For our podcast, because it keeps coming up in different ways, we can just say trust in the meta-narrative.
Trust in the meta-narrative. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. There's a line from a Rilke poem where he says, "You must realize that something is happening to you, that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hand and will not let you fall." Author Blythe Baird also talks about this one poem, and I love the way that she puts it, where she's like, my dog really wants chocolate, and I know that the chocolate is going to kill the dog.
Yeah.
And she's so sad when I don't give her the chocolate. So I wonder, is that how the universe thinks about me when I really want something and it doesn't happen and I get really sad about it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can relate to that. A bird, whenever she tries to drink coffee directly from my cup, I'm like, no, you sweet child, this will explode your little heart in a matter of 5 minutes. And yet she's so distraught when I don't let her drink coffee from my cup.
Yeah. Oh, she's so cute.
and again, not only is there this meta-narrative, but within the meta-narrative, there must needs be transformation and growth.
Mm-hmm.
Like a really famous Sufi mystic poet, Rumi, he's like the guy, right? The most famous. There's this poem where at the very beginning he says, I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to animal. I died as an animal and I was a man. Why should I fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
When was I less by dying? There's a really great line from Tales of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. She says, quote, what goes too long unchanged destroys itself. The forest is forever because it dies and so lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think I really wanted to bring up the natural world because this is kind of this idea of we should not give in to despair, we should not give in to fear, because there is this design that we can tap into and use to problem solve and persevere, is kind of the same as is the view held by science, which you discussed, I think, in our very first episode.
Yeah.
But I wanted to bring it up because we rewatched The Martian the other night. And there's a bit at the very, I mean, the whole movie is kind of an homage to this idea of like human resilience and hope going hand in hand with
problem solving
and with the potential and the beauty of science and the ability to like have an understanding of the universal laws of nature and just being able to work with those, you know, align yourself with those and keep going and keep going and keep going. And ultimately there will be a payout. There's something that Matt Damon says at the end of the movie where he goes, like he's finally back on Earth after like a year and a half of being the only guy on Mars.
I think it's like many years later when he's now an older man and he's teaching.
Yeah, and he's telling his grad students about the fact, he says that when you're out there, and we can, in the movie out there is space, but we can think of out there as when you're just living your life, right? It is inevitable that you will encounter a situation where you think, this is it. I'm going to die. This is like, it is an insurmountable odd. You are faced with awful difficulty. And he says that you can either give in to that and despair and give up.
The dark side.
Yeah, good, Anakin, good. Or you can take a deep breath and start problem solving.
Yeah.
And
you put in the work.
You put in the work. And in his philosophy, the problem solving is you have an understanding of the universal laws of science. And as a scientist, you are able to tap into those laws and use what you know and work outwardly, work to solve the problems around you according to those universal patterns. And I think the same is true, the same is reflected of patterns like love, compassion,
in Star Wars,
etc. in Star Wars.
All the heroes and all the people who end up coming out triumphant, it's because they managed to tap into those principles and things embedded within, right? They realize what controls the flow of the universe, right? And I think as far as this issue of transformation and change goes, I particularly really like Ezra and Kanan's development, I think, in Star Wars Rebels as opposed to other Jedi.
Basically, they're the superior relationship in Star Wars.
Well, no, I mean in terms of the main lesson that's told through their story
yeah.
has a lot to do with, and I think it's particularly relevant for younger people because that's what the show is aimed towards, a younger demographic. It has to do with learning and understanding that when seemingly terrible things happen in life, when you lose a loved one or when things are taken from you, when your life is changed and you feel hopeless, you don't feel like you have control, there's always space and room for growth and transformation. And that none of that is the end. Those people are always with you. Everything you learn from them, everything that you have is a part of what you're doing moving forward. The compassion that you had for that person, the compassion they had for you should be able to fuel you in giving it to others. and there isn't really a limit on a relationship between two people, right? You can never see each other again, and that relationship will always still be there. That kind of embracing of growth and transformation. Not necessarily that you're like, oh, hey, like Calamity, come here. I'm really happy to like have you in my home. Please, like, kill my friends and family.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that, but it's being in peace and balance and contentment with life and the turmoil of life.
Well, it's kind of a constructive resilience. You're able to endure, you're able to be productively resilient when you realize that you have access to the meta-narrative or the basic principles governing reality, whether they be scientific natural laws or they be more metaphysical human
and it requires that faith in those laws. It requires that faith in the meta-narrative, right? Where it's not necessarily blind faith where you don't know what you're doing and you just kind of do something. You understand the principles of how does that meta-narrative work. In the case of Star Wars, it works through sacrifice and discipline and love for one another and endeavoring towards growth and transformation and outward looking. I mean, I think a fun example, just because I want to shout out the game again, I really like the story in Fallen Order. I didn't want to get too much into it here because it's kind of more of a side property as far as Star Wars goes. But for anyone out there who's played the game, there's a very sweet moment between the main character and his buddy droid where you learn essentially that, I don't want to spoil anything, but you learn essentially that the droid made a big sacrifice and chose the main character as his companion. And that understanding that someone could, without knowing him, sacrifice in order to help him, almost allows the main character to see that he has now been able to reward after, because he learns this after they've already journeyed and become friends. He realizes that he unconsciously, through just being a good person and being kind and gentle and helpful, was able to reward someone else's faith in the meta-narrative, right? The droid didn't know what was going to happen, but he was able to tap into that larger plan by being there for someone who he didn't know. And just by helping him, he ends up fulfilling that droid's story, right? And likewise, the droid is able to help fulfill his journey. There's a very sweet kind of, it's not necessarily prophecy, but in everyone's life, you don't know who and what is going to help you self-actualize. You don't know what events are going to lead you to that growth and transformation. But when you accept everything that comes towards you and approach it with that outwardly motivated attitude, that it's not inwardly, you're not looking to yourself, that's when you begin to discover and see that connection. And that helps reinforce itself. Just as when people look inwards, when the Sith, like Vader, feels self-pity and doubt, and that fuels his actions that create reinforcing feelings that further drive him into this pit of despair.
The pit of despair.
The same thing happens. There's an outward feedback loop that reinforces itself and confirms that understanding of the Force, essentially.
Yeah. This is a great place to conclude. We talked about detachment as a type of peace, and I wanted to bring up one of my favorite, I say this every time.
It's okay, you can have infinite favorites.
Yes, I have a lot of love in my heart for many different paragraphs of writing. There is a statement by a man named Black Elk, who was a spiritual leader and medicine man of the Lakota people between the 1800s and the 1900s. Quote, "The first peace, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness, with the universe and all its powers. And when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, and that this center is really everywhere, it is within each of us. This is the real peace, and the others are but reflections of this. The second peace is that which is made between two individuals, and the third is that which is made between two nations. But above all, you should understand that there can never be peace between nations until there is known that true peace, which, as I have often said, is within the souls of men." I think this is an excellent summation of the implications of that kind of detachment and why it's so important. And I think it's reflected in Star Wars as well, that detachment does not discount community, love, togetherness. In fact, it actively leads to togetherness.
Yeah. And I think that's why the concept of the true Jedi, when Luke states at the end of the story that I am a Jedi like my father before me, the reason that that's so powerful is it because it's because I'm just excited. It's because it represents the culmination of his identity in bringing the galaxy together, inspire others,
his friends,
and at the end of the day, it represents his choice to be a part of that community, to represent love and to fight for it in a metaphorical sense, I guess,
but also
as well
a literal
as
sense. Yeah.
I love Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason why Star Wars is such a universal story and is so timeless. We rewatched the entirety of Star Wars over Christmas break this year.
Well, it's still kind of fresh. We watched all the movies. We're not including the sequel films. The first 6 movies.
Well, we did it in order, right?
Yeah, we did
4, 5, 1, 2, 3,
6.
No, wait, we did 4, 5, 1, 2, Clone Wars.
Yeah. 6. No, sorry,
3, 6.
And then
Rebels.
If you haven't seen Rebels, slightly rough if you aren't a big fan of kids shows, but season 4 of that show is an absolute masterpiece. Transcendent
Star Wars material.
I also cried at the end of that multiple times.
Yes.
There was like a 4-month period where I could not listen to the soundtrack of that season without crying. Also, I replayed Fallen Order.
Yeah, and he replayed Fallen Order. But the reason why I brought it up was that I think this year in particular, we rewatched Star Wars and we both ended up just bawling our eyes out at the end of Return of the Jedi.
Oh my god, the ending always gets me.
I think that partially it's because it is, for me, so profoundly hopeful and inspiring, not in like a fluffy emotional way, though it is deeply emotional to me. Given everything we've spoken about and given the uncertain and chaotic nature of the world that we're in right now, this year in particular, rewatching Star Wars really hit home in the sense that it was a profound reminder of both the true despair that we can face as a humanity and also the true potential and power and capacity for good that is in every individual if only we work together towards it and we like support one another in it.
Yeah, well, just as an individual, it really, I think, helps reinforce that choice that you have.
Autonomy, free will.
Well, with respect to...
Lucas says this. Yeah. He says very clearly, the Force has a design, but you very much have a free will within that design to either align yourself with the design or like totally go against it.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening. As always, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to put them in the comments below.
I'm just going to say it. I think this is our best episode so far.
Bye, everyone.